This is Sister Magobe Trifosa from Stabilis Treatment Center, a rehabilitation center of substance and alcohol. Today we are going to be touching on a topic, drug addiction as a pandemic problem and how the brain is affected by that. The biggest question that one sits with when they've got a drug addiction problem is that how did I end up here? How did I end up in this situation where I am using drugs that is affecting my life and I can't control it? With teenagers in puberty stage, they tend to have peer pressure and want to fit in a certain group of friends. Now, when one friend is smoking, the rest of the crew is going to smoke because they want to feel the sense of belonging. In some other cases, it's when one has stress at work, they are under a lot of pressure. Some can't cope with life, some is domestic issues. They've got this belief that should I use drugs, everything is going to be okay, which is a myth. Now, here we are going to be touching on what is drug abuse, what is drug dependence, and what is drug addiction. Drug abuse is uncontrolled use of drug that affects normal daily life, which leads to the following: drug dependence. It's when an individual depends on drugs for normal physiological functions. Eventually, it leads to drug addiction, which is a substance abuse disorder that affects a person's brain and behavior and leads to inability to control the use of legal or illegal drugs. Some other legal drugs are addictive as well. For example, benzos and codeine. We are going to touch on how the brain is affected when one is using drugs or one is drug dependent or has a drug addiction. The effect of drugs on the brain. Firstly, the limbic system is the part of the brain that is affected. The limbic system is often referred to as a brain reward center. It is responsible for making us feel pleasure when we eat, socialize, and have sex, or even the usage of drugs. It also affects our emotions responses to help us distinguish between the positive emotions like joy and the negative ones like sadness. It is when the chemical called dopamine is released during the situation in which people experiences pleasure. This release of dopamine helps reinforce the pleasurable behavior, increasing the likelihood that the individual will repeat the same behavior just to get the same feeling. What is dopamine? Dopamine is implicated in feelings of pleasure and plays a big role in addiction. People with substance dependence may grow dependent, particularly because of the activation of dopamine. Some other ways dopamine can actually affect our bodies, it's by regulating mood. Sufficient dopamine can contribute to depression. Meanwhile, too much depression could cause mania. Mania, we mean wild behavior and violence behavior. It can also help to regulate sleep. Dopamine helps inhibit the production of melatonin towards the end of the night, contributes to awake and sleeplessness. Our brain remembers that the type of activities during the usage of drugs brings us pleasure and make us feel happy. In a way, it encourages us to repeat the same type of behavior and avoid those that create negative responses. Secondly, our cerebral cortex and frontal cortex are affected. The cerebral cortex helps us process and interpret information from different sources using the senses of sight, smell, taste, sound, and touch. For instance, you accidentally touch a hot burner and the cerebral cortex interprets this action as painful since we burned our hand. Conversely, touching something soft and warm can be processed as inviting and good. For example, a brain of a drug addict will register a burning sensation as much slower, resulting to potential injuries. It also affects our frontal cortex, situated in front of the cerebral cortex. It's where all the thinking and the thought process occurs. This part of the brain helps us reason, make decisions, solve problems, communicate with others, determine risk and rewards of our behavior and actions. Example, not knowing what's right is wrong. A brain of a drug user can actually not be able to distinguish between right and wrong. For example, in situation where someone is in a nightclub and they accidentally step on someone's toes, instead of thinking of walking away from the situation without causing any chaos, they would eventually start a fight. The third part that is affected of the brain is the brainstem. The brainstem is responsible for performing many of the body's autonomic responses, like breathing and keeping our hearts beating. It also serves as a gateway between the other parts of the body and the brain by relaying signals and information to and from the brain through the central nervous system. Our body has special cells called neurons that carries messages from and to the brain and other parts of the body. The neurons send messages to each other by releasing chemical substances called neurotransmitters into the gaps between the cells. With the brain of a drug user, the neurons are transported to the brainstem slower, and it affects our heart in a way that it slows down, elevates, or irregulates heart rate and breathing. Thank you for tuning in. Our next topic will be about how drug addiction or drug usage affects our digestive system.